The surveyor's departure left no echo, only the print of their boots softening in thawing mud until rain erased even that. Yet the cove did not resume silence, it assumed a hush more deliberate, the kind that follows a lullaby when the singer's lips have closed but the child still listens, certain the next note must come. Weeks passed, or what passed for weeks where clocks had surrendered their hands. The 5 survivors, if survival could describe a life pared to the bone, moved through the cabins like tenants newly informed the lease extends forever but the rent will be recalculated each dawn. They did not speak of the descent they had witnessed, indeed, they did not speak at all, for language had become a utensil too sharp to handle without drawing blood. Instead they cultivated small rituals. The elder, Phineas Boggs, swept the meeting-house floor each morning with a broom of hickory twigs, though no foot had entered since the night of the sinkhole. He swept until the boards gleamed like the inner lid of a coffin, then stood back to study the pattern of bristle marks, searching for some alphabet that might spell reprieve. The mother of the twins, Sarah Ari, her children now no more than a texture missing from her arms, milked a cow that gave no milk, kneading the slack udder until a thin serum dripped, cloudy as the water that gathers in a corpse's mouth. She caught it in a tin cup and left it on the stoop, where by dusk it had evaporated, leaving a rim of grey crystals that tasted of thunder. The 12-year-old, Mercy Parton, wound yarn that no longer possessed colour, drawing thread from a spindle that turned of its own accord, humming a single note pitched just below audibility. The infants, twins again, though no one remarked the echo, lay in the same cradle once rocked by Sarah's vanished boys, growing not older but denser, as though time poured into them the way sand pours into a drowned sailor's pockets. At night they separated, each to a different cabin, yet all woke in the same dwelling, the one nearest the fallen oak, though they distinctly remembered bolting doors and pushing chests against them. They found their shoes arranged in a line pointing toward the stump, soles facing up, the leather newly soled with bark that still bled sap. In the frost they discovered footprints that matched their own in miniature, children's prints circling the cradle and ending beneath the infants' blankets, though the babes lay serene, mouths stained green as if they had sucked on grass that no longer grew. No one proposed flight, the trace had grown over with briars whose thorns pointed inward, and the mountain beyond seemed to have shifted its profile, presenting a cliff face where once a gap had promised egress. They understood, without conference, that the cove had become a bowl set spinning on a potter's wheel, and to step outside the rim was to risk being flung into whatever kill awaited the clay. The first thaw brought no relief. Ice withdrew like a surgeon's knife sliding from a wound that refuses to bleed. The earth, exposed, revealed a network of cracks too uniform to be natural, forming hexagons the size of shrouds. Within each hexagon the soil was darker, as though turned by a spade, and from the centers sprouted slender shoots pale as bone meal. These grew not upward but outward, laying themselves flat to the ground in spirals that, viewed from the meeting-house steps, spelled the reverse names of every person who had descended into the sinkhole. Sarah Ari knelt to trace the curve that had once been her son's, and the sprout responded by curling tighter, snapping its own stem with a sound like a wishbone breaking. A clear fluid leaked out, carrying in its scent the memory of the twin scalps after summer rain. She licked it without thinking and immediately recalled every lullaby she had ever sung, but the melodies arrived backward, the lilt of comfort recoiling into a gasp of origin. That night she dreamed of a womb whose walls were lined with teeth, and she woke to find her own molars loose, rattling like dice in the cup of her jaw. Mercy Parton, whose spindle now turned day and night, began to weave the sprouts into a fabric that existed only when viewed from the corner of the eye. Direct gaze revealed nothing but tangled weeds, yet peripherally the cloth unfurled, patterned with the reverse script from Hark's cabin walls. She worked outdoors, though winter still crouched nearby, and the cold seemed to sponsor her fingers, guiding them in stitches too fine for human tendons. When the textile reached the length of a shroud, she carried it to the cradle and laid it over the infants. At once their density lessened, they floated slightly, blankets sagging beneath invisible shoulders, and their breathing synchronized with the slow rotation of the spindle. The cloth absorbed their exhalations, growing thicker, until one morning the cradle stood empty, the textile now a cocoon suspended from the rafters by a single strand of yarn that glimmered with the same subterranean fire once seen in the sinkhole. Mercy tried to touch it and found her hand passing through, encountering warmth on the far side, as though the fabric were a doorway to a room she had unknowingly always occupied. Phineas Boggs, sweeping still, discovered that the meeting house floor had begun to bow in the center, forming a shallow saucer. Each morning the depression deepened by the thickness of a playing card, and with it the sound of his broom changed, the bristles whispering syllables that might have been Latin had Latin been spoken by worms. He listened, because listening was the last liberty left, and gradually he understood that the floor was becoming a drum whose skin must be kept taut if the thing beneath desired to speak. One dawn he found a knot in the pine plank pulsing like a heart. When he touched it, a splinter slid beneath his nail, carrying with it a vision of Jedediah Crone hanging upside down in a well of roots, mouth open to receive the drip of sap that was not sap but memory itself. Phineas withdrew the splinter and tasted iron decades old, the flavor of the bullet he had bitten during the war when field surgeons lacked rum, the taste of his own fear when he had deserted hours before the battle whose name he could no longer pronounce. He realized then that the cove was not forgetting, it was stockpiling remembrance, distilling it the way a still condenses moonshine, and when the brew reached proof, it would be decanted into whatever vessel remained. The infant's cocoon ripened. Its outer layer darkened to the color of river silt, and inside could be heard the slow churn of contented digestion. Mercy, Sarah, and Phineas gathered beneath it each evening, though they never planned to meet. They sat in a triangle, knees touching, breathing in unison though none had instructed the others. The fire they did not light cast shadows that moved counterclockwise, and in those shadows they saw rehearsals of their former lives, Sarah teaching the twins to whistle through a blade of grass, Phineas nailing the silence decree, Mercy winding her first skein while her mother hummed. But the performances were marred by subtle reversals, grass whistled inward, the nail withdrawing itself, the skein unwinding into the rabbit from whose fur it had been spun. They watched without protest, because protest belonged to the same lexicon as hope, and both had been removed from circulation. On the eve of the spring equinox, the cocoon split along a seam that exhaled the odor of apples left too long in a closed trunk. Out crawled not infants but twin saplings, their trunks the exact circumference of the children's thighs, their leaves the shape of milk teeth. Roots dangled like umbilical cords, still dripping the clear fluid that had once leaked from the snapped sprouts. The saplings bent toward the humans, leaves trembling in a semaphore none could read, then walked, there is no other word, on root tips across the floorboards, leaving prints of moisture that dried into the reverse names of the descended. They exited into the night, and the three followed at the distance one maintains when escorting a hearse. The saplings made straight for the white oak stump, now overgrown with a fungus that glowed the color of a healing bruise. There they planted themselves, roots writhing into the earth with a sound like silk tearing. At once the fungus dimmed, and the spiral sprouts that had carpeted the hexagons withered, releasing a perfume of lullabies sung backward. The cove sighed, a long subsidence as when a grave is finally filled, and the three felt the floor of memory tilt, pouring everything toward the saplings, which began to swell, trunks cracking open to reveal not rings but strata, layers of clothing, scraps of psalm, the glint of Jedediah Crone's bullet, the widow's wedding ring embedded like a knot. Sarah knelt and pressed her ear to the widening trunk. Inside she heard the pulse of horse hooves receding, the echo of the surveyor's boots, the soft rotational hum of Mercy's spindle. She understood that the tree was becoming the cove's new chronicle, a living archive that digested event and regurgitated artifact. She also understood, without revulsion, for revulsion had been steamed out of her, that the infants were not lost but translated, promoted to the rank of keepers, and that keepers must be fed. She drew the loose tooth from her jaw and pressed it into the bark, where it was accepted with a soft wet click. Mercy contributed a strand of hair, grey though she was barely 13. Phineas offered the splinter beneath his nail, still wet with ancestral fear. The tree closed over these tributes, bark knitting without scar, and at once the reverse names on the ground rearranged themselves into a single sentence legible in ordinary light: the mouth is closed that once was rent. They returned to their cabins before sunrise, though the concept of return had grown elastic. The cradle had vanished, leaving only a cradle-shaped absence that ached in the periphery of vision. The meeting-house floor had leveled itself, but the knot remained, now sprouting a tiny shoot that grew not wood but cloth, the same corner of the wry textile Mercy had woven. They understood that the cove had achieved a new equilibrium, an economy whose currency was remembrance and whose interest compounded nightly. They were the tellers, though they had nothing left to tell, and the tree was the vault, though it stood open to the wind. Summer came impersonally, the way a stranger might hand you a letter addressed to someone deceased. The mountain's profile had settled into a shape that, viewed from the collapsed prayer yard, resembled a man lying on his side, mouth open to drink the sky. No birds returned, yet the air vibrated with wings that cast no shadow. Sarah found that when she milked the serumless cow, the udder now produced a clear oil that burned without smoke. She used it to light the cabin where she no longer lived, and the flame danced always to the left, as though attracted by a breeze traveling backward through time. Mercy's spindle turned of its own accord, winding threads that rose into the rafters and formed clouds of yarn which, when viewed from below, showed the map of a country that would exist centuries hence, its coastlines already eroding. Phineas stopped sweeping. The meeting-house floor had grown glossy as obsidian, reflecting not faces but the undersides of their thoughts, the raw umber of unspoken crime. They met only at the tree, whose girth now required 3 arm spans to encircle. Within the bark they could see their own memories being worked like dough, the moment Sarah's twins first crawled, Mercy's mother humming, Phineas deserting the battlefield, all needed until the distinctions blurred. They felt neither pride nor grief, only the mild curiosity of artisans examining a nearly finished piece. They understood that when the kneading was complete, the cove would be fully digested, rendered portable, a capsule that might be carried to the next place in need of purgation. And they understood, this with a flicker of something almost like anticipation, that they themselves were the capsule's casing, the pericardium around a heart that had learned to beat backward. One August night, when the mountain silhouette lay sharpest against a moon bleached to the color of parchment, the tree split with a report louder than any rifle. From the cleft stepped a figure they recognized at first as Ephraim Hark, hat eaten, scar glowing. But the face beneath the brim was their own. Composite, a portrait painted in flesh by an artist who had never seen a human in the round. It spoke with their combined voices, reverse syllables re-reversed until they approached something like clarity. The ledger is balanced. The mouth is sealed. The seed proceeds. Then the figure collapsed into a heap of clothing, out of which crawled the infants, not as they had been, but as they would have been had they lived, toddlers, then adolescents, then young adults, aging in accelerated flips of a zoetrope until they reached the age at which the mountain itself had been born. At that moment the ridge shuddered, the cliff face profile cracking along the jawline, and a wind issued from the fissure carrying the odor of apples, gunpowder, and milk about to turn. The 3 tellers, though the word had lost all meaning, felt themselves lifted, not bodily but memorially, every memory stripped clean and folded into a square the size of a communion wafer. They opened their mouths, and the squares floated out, luminous, drifting toward the gap in the mountain whose outline now matched the reversed fingerprint stamped on every relic since the beginning. They understood that they were being asked to choose, swallow the squares again and remain as guardians of an empty cove, or allow them to pass through and become the next curse elsewhere. They chose as one chooses to exhale when the lungs have grown weary of the burden. The squares vanished into the fissure, and with them went the last sensory echo of bird call, lullaby, axe bite, kiss. Morning arrived, but it was not morning as it had been. It was a negative, a plate from which the image had been developed and now refused to print again. The cabin stood, but their doors opened onto interiors that had never contained people, hearths cold since the day the logs were felled, beds never rumpled by dream. The meeting house clock lay on the floor, hands restored but pointing to the hour of every death that would now never occur. The tree had become a stump once more, smooth as if turned on a lathe, its concentric layers showing not years but the congealed absence of years. And the three, Sarah, Mercy, Phineas, stood barefoot on the packed earth, their shadows falling due south though the sun stood north, footprints already filling with a fine dust the color of old wedding cake. They walked toward the trace, because motion was the only article left in stock. The briars had receded, leaving a path wide enough for a single cart. They followed it downhill, past the place where the widow's wagon had been swallowed, past the laurel thicket now leafless and brittle as paper. Behind them, the mountain's profile softened, cliff becoming slope, the jawline dissolving into a smile neither cruel nor kind, merely finished. They did not look back, they had forgotten the concept of backward. At the foot of the ridge they encountered a creek they did not remember, flowing in the wrong direction, its ripples spelling their reverse names. They stepped into it, because wetness was a sensation still available, and the water closed above their ankles without chill. When they lifted their feet, the prints remained, not in mud but in air, hanging like translucent stepping stones that began slowly to rise. They followed them, upward into nothing, each stride erasing the one behind, until the last footprint faded and with it the last obligation to remember the cove at all. Years later, though years themselves had grown negotiable, travelers speak of a ridge where no ridge appears on any map, a place where the sound of a spindle can be heard turning in a wind that carries the smell of scalded milk. They tell of finding a single white oak leaf, out of season, pressed between the pages of a Bible that has no psalms, only blank leaves veined like the inside of a wrist. They mention, if pressed, the faint taste of iron that lingers at the back of the tongue after prayer, and the way their own footprints, viewed in moonlight, seem to point the wrong direction, as though the earth itself had begun to walk backward into whatever mouth first rent it. But these are travelers' tales, and travelers must move on, carrying nothing but the stories they will later swear they never told. Somewhere, perhaps, the capsule drifts, a seed of compressed remembrance seeking soil fertile with the language of unmaking. Somewhere, perhaps, a child wakes tasting apples and gunpowder, and a woman finds a reversed fingerprint bruised into the skin of her newborn's thigh. The ledger is never closed, it merely changes hands. And the mouth that was rent stands ready to open again, softly, like a prayer spoken in a tongue no one remembers except in dreams that leave the sleeper unsure whether they have been blessed or bled. The cove endures, not as place but as procedure, a slow turning of the spindle that winds what was into what will be, until the two grow indistinguishable, and the thread, pulled taut, hums a single note pitched just below audibility, a note that, once heard, is never quite forgotten, though the ear spends the rest of life leaning toward the silence that follows, waiting for the next syllable of the